everyone, welcome to the June 16th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski, and we are looking ahead to some weekend racing in New Jersey, as the focus of this week's podcast is going to be Monmouth Park's Saturday card, specifically the late pick 5 sequence at Monmouth on their 14-race Saturday card. So this sequence comprises races 10 through 14, and included in this pick 5 are 4 stakes races, as they did attract some star power in these races at Monmouth on Saturday. It begins with the Pegasus, takes us through the Eatontown on turf for the fillies and mares, the Salvatore Mile, grade 3 event for the older horses on the dirt, the Monmouth Stakes, another graded stakes event on the turf for the older males, and then we close things out with the one non-stakes event in this sequence. That's an allowance race for the 3-year-olds sprinting on dirt at the end of the day. But Greg, some familiar names throughout these stakes races.
I was surprised when you mentioned Monmouth. I hadn't looked at the card yet, but when I opened it, I saw some names that we've talked about many times in the past, some horses I've grown some attachment to over the years. So yeah, I like this sequence. May not be the greatest betting sequence, and I know you've told me there is a chance of some rain, so we'll have to keep an eye on the turf races. If they're off turf, they're not races I'd be interested in, but otherwise, I think it's a nice sequence and fun to handicap.
Yeah, as you kind of allude to, there are some favorites in this sequence that look pretty tough to beat. We'll talk about that as we go through this sequence. But there are just a few races that don't have the biggest fields, not a ton of alternatives. And as you said, the weather situation is one that you want to keep an eye on if you're thinking about playing Monmouth or any of the tracks in this area on Saturday, because there is plenty of rain predicted on Friday. I'm recording this at about noon on Friday, and there's supposed to get some rain this afternoon. Less rain predicted on Saturday, but I think it depends on how much rain the turf courses take this evening to see if they can race on the turf tomorrow. So we'll see how that all works out. If these races do come off the turf, the sequence would become much less appealing, or perhaps not appealing at all, because there are no MTOs in these turf stakes races, and most of the runners don't really have much dirt form. So you could easily see some of these races falling apart if they are transferred to the main track. But we'll keep our fingers crossed and be optimistic for the time being. Let's dive into this sequence, Craig, and we're going to begin with one of those stakes races. It is the Pegasus, race 10, a mile and the 16th on the dirt for the 3-year-olds, and this is the local prep for the Haskell. We'll see if we actually get any Haskell competitors coming out of this race that are serious factors, because that often draws plenty of 3-year-olds from the Triple Crown races. But we do have a quality field here, including a couple of runners from the Todd Pletcher stable. First and foremost among them is the morning line favorite, King's Barnes, and I get why this horse is favored, Craig. He was considered one of the players heading into the Kentucky Derby. I know that neither you or I were big fans of him on Derby Day, but if you want to give him an excuse for that race, you certainly can, because he was involved in that suicidal early pace, and we have seen others come out of that race that were involved in the pace, specifically Verifying, who came back last week at Ellis Park and ran a much improved race in the Matt win there. So there are some reasons to believe that King's Barnes could rebound here.
Yeah, I mean, this is a long way from the Kentucky Derby, and he was a horse when I saw the entries. I thought I would be pretty enthused to try to beat him, and I don't love him in this spot, but he certainly would be, it would be foolish, in my opinion, to toss him out as a contender. He draws a good post. There's not a ton of speed in this race, and it's not like it drew a bunch of horses with speed figures better than him, but that said, I do want to give a few others a shot in here. I'll start with the number six Subrogate. Uh, he's a horse who broke his maiden last time at Belmont. Did it with a very nice speed figure. The runner-up from that race came back to not run very well at 2-5, but I do think that horse had some excuses that day, so I'm not going to hold it against him. I still think the figure's pretty solid, and that 114 he ran that day is better than anything we've seen from King's Barnes, even in his victories. Now, his victories, there were some issues with King's Barnes. The Louisiana Derby just set a crazy slow pace. It was impossible to run any kind of good figure or final time that day. So maybe he's got a forward move in him as well. But for me, the top horse and the horse to beat is that 6 Subrogate.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how Subrogate runs here. He's 5-1 on the morning line. I could see him going off around that price because it feels like Kings Barnes has to take a lot of money here just based on those company lines. I don't know what to do with Subrogate. Like you said, his maiden victory came back very fast. I think you had it a little faster than Bayer did because you guys handled the speed figures a little differently on that day at Belmont. It was a weird day where it seemed like the track might have changed midway through the day. But putting all of that aside, it wasn't the most visually impressive performance. I mean, he had to work for it. The Todd Pletcher trained first-time starter Abedin, who was running after him, really took a good shot at him all the way to the wire. And like you said, that horse came back to not run badly, but not nearly run back to the same speed figure in his subsequent start at Monmouth Park. So I have some questions about the quality of that race that he's coming out of. His debut was fine, but he failed to change leads that day and was fading a bit at the end. I wonder if this horse really wants to go a mile on the 16th, just given the way he improved on the turn back to a sprint last time. I know as a son of Arrogate, you just assume this horse might want to run all day, but watching his last race, I don't know about that. I'm kind of on the fence about him, and I would have to let price be my guide. If he drifts up from that 5-1, I could get interested, and we can obviously see the board, this being the first leg of the sequence, but I wasn't totally sold on this horse. There are a couple of others that I'm a little more interested in, Craig. I mean, the other Todd Pletcher trainee in this race, Classic Catch, he's a horse that I've been a little bit of a fan of along the way. I just think that he's one that has a powerful finish on him when he's placed at the right company level, and he might have just been in over his head in his last couple of starts. I thought he had a bit of a chance in the Wood Memorial 2-back, but he just got way too far behind in the early stages of that race, was actually doing some running at the end. And then last time, on this, at first glance, his Peter Pan looks pretty disappointing, but when you kind of go back and reassess that race, I mean, Arcangelo has proven to be one of the best 3-year-olds in the country at this point after winning the Belmont last week, and who knows how good Bishop's Bay is ultimately going to prove to be. So that might have been a race that was almost as tough as some of the Triple Crown races, and I'm not going to hold it against him that he didn't quite get up for third that day. He was a little more keen than usual with the blinkers on, but I like that they at least kept him closer to the pace than he was in that Wood Memorial. So I wouldn't be surprised if Classic Catch is another one that appreciates some of the class relief he's getting here, and he figures to be a better price than Kings Barnes.
Yeah, we have different opinions on that one. I'm not a fan. I don't like to turn back in distance. It is a drop in class for sure, but I'm also a little worried that there's just not a lot of pace in here, and I wonder at this shorter distance if it's going to help him out. If he's going to get any help on the front end, I should say. So he's one I didn't really want to use. One that I did want to use is Salute the Stars, the 4-horse. He debuted in the Brad Cox barn in his first start as a 3-year-old. He had run on turf previously as a 2-year-old. And normally I'm pretty wary of these off the turf races, even when they get a big figure. But I actually think this horse ran pretty well, and he showed me something when he actually took the lead, was stalked a little bit, faced some pressure, was able to drop back off of it, still came back on to get the win. So he's one that I actually think might slip through the cracks a little bit when people see that off the turf race and the big gap and the couple turf races early on. And I think he may very well be better on dirt than he is on turf.
Yeah, he's an interesting horse because he actually has much more of a dirt pedigree. He's by versatile sire Candy Rye, but the dam is a half to Carpe Diem and Farrell, who were both graded stakes level dirt horses. Carpe Diem obviously went on to be a mediocre sire, mostly getting dirt runners. So there's definitely evidence that Salute the Stars is just on the right surface now, and I thought he showed some real grit in that last race. I mean, he was covered up behind horses, looked like he had run around the far turn, but had to wait for room. And when he got through, he really burst through pretty impressively. And, there were 3 horses battling to the wire, and it looked like the runner in between horses kind of almost clipped heels with him at the 16th ball, but he kept battling on to the finish and was able to get the job done that day. If that last speed figure is legitimate, and like you said, there are reasons to believe that it is, I think he's a player here. So I'd be looking to use Classic Catch, Salute the Stars, and Kings Barnes in this race. Maybe that's going a little deeper than some because Kings Barnes does look formidable if you're just assuming that he's going to improve off that against the flow trip in the Kentucky Derby last time. But like you, I'm just not totally convinced as to his overall quality still. So I wanted to keep an open mind with regard to some others.
Yeah, I think we agree. I mean, it's not like he was a factor in the Derby. He was out of it by the time they were, with a furlong to go and was beaten badly. I mean, I don't want to hold it against him too much, but he's a horse who's probably going to be 7 to 5, maybe even a little bit lower. So I also don't want to cut him a lot of excuses. And I think he's in a field where he fits, but he doesn't really tower over them.
And I'll just make the point. Based on your statements, I think I view this as a more competitive pace situation than you do. Subrogate is shown on a clear lead on the Timeform US pace projector, but that's just a function of him competing in a sprint race last time. We often see sprinters stretching out shown on clear leads. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to run as fast as they did in the prior sprint race, and him being such a lightly raced horse, his early pace rating is based so much on that recent sprint race. But I mean, the number 3, No Confession, it seems like a horse that wants to be forward, especially when he's going longer, and Kings Barnes has been forward. Even Salute the Stars was pretty aggressive in the early stages of his race last time. So, I mean, I could see this pace being somewhat competitive. Not that I think it's going to totally fall apart or that it needs to, but I didn't necessarily see Subrogate just controlling on the front end through slow fractions is the point that I was trying to make.
No, I do agree with that. When I looked at this, I kind of viewed this race as a two-speed horse race, Subrogate and Kings Barnes. The 3, maybe he could, but I suspect he would be more in a tracking position tucked in behind. But yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it'll be easy on the front end, but usually with just 2 horses up front, things don't get too crazy. I would imagine the pace would be about average.
Let's move on to the next leg of this sequence, race 11. It is the Grade 3 Eatontown going the mile and the 16th distance on the turf for fillies and mares. And Craig, we've got a returning Grade 1 winner in this race in the number 8, Gina Romantica, who is making her 4-year-old debut for the Chad Brown barn. She got really good last year when they switched her over to the turf. She had been a little bit of a disappointment on the dirt, considering that they paid $1 million for her as a yearling, but when they switched over to grass in that risk averse, she just really changed into a different kind of horse, coming from off the pace, producing a really nice turn of foot that day. Was a little unlucky in the pebbles next time when the pace worked against her and she got a wide trip, but it all worked out in the QE2 last time when she earned that Grade 1 victory over her stablemate McCulloch to get the job done, going away by nearly 2 lengths at the end. And if she repeats that 123 Timeform US speed figure that she earned that day, she's going to be a handful, but it has a long layoff, and we'll see if she's ready to fire her best shot coming back off the break.
Yeah, that is the big question. I would say the 2 most likely winners, in my opinion, have some pretty big questions. I looked up the Chad Brown stats in Formulator, as I'm sure most people will do. Chad Brown wins a lot in these situations. He also gets bet pretty heavily. So you're not going to get. I would be very surprised if you got 3-1 on Gina Romanica. Feels more like an 8-5, 9-5 type horse to me in this field. But she can win. I'm certainly not knocking her and saying she can't win. She draws okay on the outside. She has good tactical speed. So she's certainly a player, in my opinion, and one that you have to take very seriously. The other one that I think is the second most likely winner is Malvath, the 6 horse. I don't know what happened last time. I think it's a good sign that Christophe Clement's bringing her back pretty quickly. She was coming off that layoff from the Breeders' Cup where she was only beaten a little bit over a length or a little bit less than 2 lengths, ran a huge figure. If she were a colt or a male, I would be a little more concerned about that last race, but I've mentioned it before. I've just learned over the years you can be a little more excusing of female races that when they just don't show up. She's been working fine ever since. So if she runs back anything close to that Breeders' Cup mile, she could very well win this race at what should be an okay price.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you about the likely betting in this race, I have to imagine Gina Romantic is going to be a clear favorite here. 3-1 seems a little generous. Like you said, 8-5, 9-5. That seems about right on a horse like her. Assuming that she's ready off the layoff. And I mean, I haven't seen any of her workouts. I don't know how she's training. But Chad Brown, as you said, I mean, he wins with these types. They just tend to be short prices, as she is likely to be. I really don't know how they're going to bet Malavoth, and she is a difficult horse to assess here because, I mean, she just wasn't a little off last time. I mean, she did not run a step in that race. I mean, she came under a ride around the far turn, just trying to stay in contact with a slow pace, and she was having trouble keeping up, and then she just completely shut down in the stretch of that race. I don't know what the excuse was. Like you said, maybe she was just had an off day. It seems like the connections must not know either because she went right back to working after that. I mean, her next workout was on May 7th. So, I mean, it didn't seem like she got too much time off. Like there was a setback coming out of that race. I mean, she's trained consistently ever since then. And now they're targeting a graded stakes race. I don't know what to make of it. It was her first start going out for a new barn. She had been purchased, I believe, for $3 million at the end of last season, primarily as a broodmare prospect, but they also wanted to race her this year as a 4-year-old. And sometimes going from one barn to another can make a big difference. As big a difference as we saw last time, I don't know. And I mean, Christophe Clement certainly knows how to train. It's hard to make an excuse for the last race. And I have trouble, taking any kind of short price on a horse that I just have to draw a line through the race with no reason why. So I'm a little leery on her. And, if she's 8-1, I could use her. If she's 4-1, 7-2, to me, this is way too low on a horse that I have real concerns about whether she can still run or not. I think there are some others to consider, though, Craig. I mean, we have horses with recency and good recent form that I think are players in this race, like the two that finished second and third in the Beaugay last time behind market segmentation. And that form has certainly been flattered by the fact that she came back to win the Grade 1 New York in her next start. Maybe somewhat fortunate because she had things her own way up front, but market segmentation had run a big speed figure in that Beaugay, kind of stretching out the field at the end and proved it was no fluke. Of the two coming out of that race, I would tend to favor surprisingly over Consumer Spending. Consumer Spending was off a layoff, and she's the other Chad Brown runner in this race. And you do generally assume that these Chad Brown runners are ready to go off layoff. So I don't know how much improvement I want to project as she's now second off a layoff in this Eatontown. But I just thought the Consumer Spending had a better trip than surprisingly because she was saving ground around the turn, got the tip out perfectly at the top of the stretch, and just couldn't really kick for home with her stablemate, but surprisingly broke from the outside post position. She was 3 wide on the turn, had to pause a little bit because the horses in front of her weren't really going anywhere, had to swing out 4 wide to make her run at the top of the stretch, and she just never looked totally comfortable being out there and still finished up willingly to almost be in a photo with Consumer Spending at the end of that race, and surprisingly just feels like one of these Shug McGahee runners that has been steadily improving race by race. She's frankly surprised me a little bit over the winter because I didn't think she could rise to these levels, but she just keeps getting better and feels like one that drew very well here, has a top rider on her back in Paco Lopez who dominates at Monmouth, and I just think this might be the right spot to take her.
Yeah, she's actually my top pick in here for most of the reasons of what you said. I just really liked that race last time. And one thing we haven't really addressed, the pace projector doesn't show any kind of flag. But there's some real pace in here, assuming this race holds together. When you look at horses like the 7 Katie's a Lady and the 4 Scottish Star, maybe Scottish Star I would even consider a win contender if the 7 wasn't in the race. But both of these horses have good, strong front early speed, particularly Katie's a Lady, the 7. So it just seems like surprisingly he almost has to get some pace, something she didn't get last time. And that would favor her more than Consumer Spending, in my opinion.
I just want to point out, I don't consider her a contender in this race, Craig, but it's kind of funny to look at Katie's a Lady's pace figure lines because it's not every day that you see a horse get an early pace rating that is nearly surpassing 200. And she did that too back in that 1 3/8 race at Tampa when she basically just ran off with her rider. And I mean, you just see those red color-coded pace figures splashed across her past performances in TimeformUS, and she's just that type. I mean, she wants to go fast. every step of the way. So I think that's a real problem for a horse like Scottish Star. Again, don't think Katie's a Lady is going to win, but she's just the kind of horse that is really hard to slow down on the front end.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I actually wrote an article years back if people want to read about a 200 plus time form US speed figure. And it was in one of those really fast races. I think it was actually a rabbit that set the race in a grade one race. So just went fast, ran off. But it's interesting kind of reading if you don't understand how the pace figures can get so high, particularly in those longer races.
Let's move on to race 12. It is the grade 3 Salvatore Mile, this one going a mile on the dirt. And Craig and I did a expanded stakes preview of this race that you can check out on DRF's YouTube channel if you want us to go through every single contender in here. We should mention at the top, Craig, that there are a couple of runners in here that are cross-entered in a different race at Parks on Sunday, those being the number 2, Riding with Biden, and the number 4, Farmo Power. So we'll see if they decide to scratch out of this race and run there instead. That could reduce this field a little bit. But one of the things that we were really harping on when we did the stakes preview is that there is quite a bit of speed in this race, and there still would be, even if those two scratched out. Just feels like there are plenty of runners drawn towards the middle of the pack that want to go forward.
Yeah, I agree. And neither one of those two who may opt to run somewhere else are shown up close. So it wouldn't really change the time form US fast-paced designation, nor should it. And yeah, when you look through these PPs, there are several horses in here that have good speed. All you have to do is look at the PPs and see a horse like the number 1, Petulante, who is usually right there on the lead, or if not, pretty close to it. And he's shown way back and forth with a pretty good big gap between the top 3. So I'd be very surprised if there's not a pretty quick pace in this race.
Yeah, it just feels like horses like Octane, Trademark, Petulant, Empty Tomb. I mean, they have to be vying for the early lead. And even the number 8, Nimitz Class, who is one of the favorites in here, he loves to be up close to the pace. But as we were pointing out when we did our stakes preview, I think the best thing for Nimitz Class is that he's drawn outside of all of that other speed. So at least he's not going to have to deal with that kickback, especially if the track comes up wet. He can just sit outside and maybe go a little bit wide, but work his way into the race at his own pace. And Nimitz Class, Craig, he has just been in spectacular form since they stretched him out to 2 turns or just route distances on the dirt. I think he's tried dirt routes now 6 times in his career in his last 7 starts, and he's been a winner all 6 times. And he's not just winning by a little bit, he is demolishing the fields that he's been facing at Laurel and Parks. And this is a step up in class for him, but he's just running speed figures that say he's supposed to be capable of winning this race.
Yeah, like I mentioned on our preview video, when I first saw the entries and saw the pace, I really didn't want to like him in here. But his speed figures are just so good. And when you really dissect his PPs and dig deep into him, even though he's up close a lot of times, he's a horse, and you see it when you watch his races too. He really can rate even on the front end. He's had plenty of races where he's been in slow pace with blue fractions in time form US, and he's able to sit a little off the lead or slow it down on the lead or even be off the pace and still come on the win. So I don't want to hold the pace against him too much, because I think in his case, his tactical speed is really an advantage, even in a race with a fast pace. And like you mentioned, I'd probably feel a little differently if he was drawn on the inside and really had the gun out of the gate or was going to take a lot of kickback. But I just don't see that being the case here. And I think he's going to be really tough to beat. He wound up being my top pick on the preview.
Yeah, I mean, if you're worried about the kind of trip he might pull, I would say just watch his race 2 back in the Native Dancer when he ran off in a speed duel early, pulling way clear of the rest of the field with, I forget if it was 1 or 2 other horses, but I mean, that was a race where those that were chasing him really paid the price as they faded far off the screen, and he opened up a huge lead on the far turn as he put away those speeds. And the runner-up American Doro, who is a bit of a mud freak, I mean, took a really strong late shot at him, and Nimitz Class just never let that runner get close. I mean, that was his top ever TimeformUS speed figure, getting a big pace upgrade there, 128, but that shows he can deal with some pretty stiff early fractions, so I wouldn't be too concerned about it with him. And Craig, I think we agree here that among the short prices, we much prefer Nimitz Class to the number 9 or Artorias, who also feels destined to take money in this race, not just because he's trained by Chad Brown and has some nice class lines from last year, but also because he is kind of the one that I feel like a lot of the handicappers are going to identify as the best closer in a race that features a lot of pace. But I just have some concerns about his overall quality, because in retrospect, he didn't beat much in that Curlin field last year, and then he didn't show up in the Travers, disappointed at the end of the season. I just think this horse has some things to prove coming off the layoff.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't know that he's beaten a very good horse yet in his career. And the layoff, we talked about it in the turf race. When I looked it up in Formulator, this is not a good stat for Chad Brown. I think he was like 2 for 22 or something like that in dirt races. Great state dirt stakes races, coming off a 180-day plus layoff with males. And the two winners, or maybe it wasn't males, it was all horses, because the two winners were Jack Christopher and Dunbar Road, both of whom were 3 to 5, towered over their fields. And that's certainly not the case here. And when I looked through that list, there were some fairly short prices on there that got beat. So it just seems like a really tough spot for him to come back. And that said, I'm not even sure he's a real closer. He seems more like a pace tracker to me, who might get caught up a little bit in that pace if he tries to make his move a little bit early.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point about him. When he's been further back, that's not when he's been successful. So we'll see how the trip works out for him. I mean, the true closer in the race is the number 10 Bourbonic, who is always launching from far, far back. And if this pace really does fall apart, that's the scenario when Bourbonic can be successful, as he was in his crowning achievement in the Wood Memorial back in, I think it was 2021, when he caused that huge upset. Bourbonic, Craig, he's kind of got this reputation as being an underachiever because he's never really gotten back to that Wood Memorial form as far as accomplishments go. But his races this winter in February at Aqueduct, both of the 1 mile races, I thought they were okay efforts. I mean, he encountered slow paces both times and got the win one time against a really solid allowance foe in Sheriff Bianco, and then, obviously was not going to be competitive with Repo Rocks. I mean, since then he's disappointed, but one of those was a turf race. So, I mean, he's one that I would want to use, just given the pace scenario and the fact that he feels like he's going to be a price.
Yeah, he's a horse. I think I picked him second, if memory serves, in my preview. If not, I know I had him up there near the front somewhere. And I think he had some real excuses, as you mentioned, the couple races, one of which he won with the slow pace, which isn't going to be do him any favors. Two back, he was in on a muddy track against Law Professor, who's shown to be kind of a mud freak, and I'm not sure Bourbonic really likes that much of a moisture in the track. When you look through his PPs, there's a lot of dull efforts when things are wet. Throw out the turf race. So if he gets a setup, I don't see any reason why this horse couldn't come running. I guess the one big concern would be that it's just at a flat mile, but that is the distance his most recent win came at, around 1 turn at Aqueduct. So I don't want to totally dismiss him at a horse that's going to be a pretty good number and should get a setup that he hasn't seen in quite a while.
Now, it might be for naught because it feels like there's a good chance that he scratches in favor of that race on Sunday, but I did go for the number 4, Farmo Power here. I'm a fan of this horse, and he has just been a magnet for bad trips and bad luck in his races. And I know that there's a really good performance in him somewhere. I mean, we saw it last year in that Parks Dirt Mile when he was disqualified for bumping with mind control in the late stages, though. Based on some recent reporting, it sounds like Pharma Power will eventually be declared the winner of that race anyway, but that's a side topic. But I mean, he ran a huge race that day. I mean, he and Mind Control drew almost a dozen lengths clear of the rest of the field, and that's one of those, Craig, where looking back in retrospect, that wasn't a race that I spent a lot of time handicapping. I don't think we did it on the podcast even, but I went back and watched his race prior to that in the Stormcat last August, and I was saying to myself, boy, I mean, the trip handicap handicapper in me might have liked this horse because he had a crazy trip in that August race right before he put forth that huge effort in the Park's Dirt Mile. Then he followed it up with another bad trip in that stakes in October. Just got really badly roughed into the first turn. That comment is quite accurate. I think he got badly sawed off in traffic and then was out of position after that. Ran a nice race to begin this year, but then he encountered a slow pace in the stymie, got steadied on the backstretch, and then last time out in that allowance race at Parks, I know he lost as a 3-5 favorite, but he basically clipped heels coming out of the starting gate as a horse came over on him significantly. So, he had a right to not run his race that day. This horse has real talent. I would advise people to look at the race on Sunday if he scratches here, because he looks like a horse that can certainly win that race at Parks. It came up a little bit easier. He basically just has to beat Riding with Biden there, and I think one of the ones that finished ahead of him last time. But I think he could do it even against this tougher field as long as the trip finally works out. We'll see if he runs here.
Yeah, I think he's dangerous. I don't want to go into it too much because you covered most of it. He's a horse who has a ton of bad trips. He's pretty versatile. He's won on the lead. He can press the pace. He's come from off the pace. So I don't think the pace is a huge issue with him. He should be able to save ground. I guess my only real concern with him would be he always seems to get into trouble, and he's had the same rider in every race in his career, and that rider's on again Saturday.
Yeah, I watched a lot of these races, and it is easy to blame the rider. He's probably made a few of the wrong decisions, but it's also just been a really bad luck for this horse. Things that happen at the start that just seem like it's out of the rider's control. So hopefully the stars are aligned for Farmo Power one of these days, and maybe that could be the case this weekend. Let's move on to race 13. It is the Grade 3 Monmouth Stakes. This one going 1.125 miles on the turf course at Monmouth. And not the biggest field signed on here, Craig. Just 6 runners. And, if this race does come off the turf, it might really fall apart because there's not a whole lot of dirt form in here. Among this field, I guess Commandeer would be pretty tough to beat in that situation. But on the turf, the horse to beat and the horse to catch is obviously the number one, Tribhuvan, who, when he's good, he's really good. We saw that when he won the Grade 1 United Nations in 2021, and then last year when he wired the field in very impressive fashion in the Grade 1 Manhattan. It's taken him a little bit longer to get back off the layoff this year to begin his 7-year-old campaign, but he's run well off layoffs before. Just looks like the only frontrunner in this field, Craig, and probably going to be tough to beat in this spot.
He will, and he's going to get bet pretty heavily. The same Chad Brown stats apply on the turf. He wins a lot. And it's interesting. We haven't really talked about how that's changed. And we've been doing this show for quite a few years now. And I can remember these always used to come up with a positive ROI. The win percentage hasn't changed all that much, but the people have caught on because the ROI has plummeted from usually in the +2s to down around the 1.6, 1.7 range. So it's just part of the pari-mutuel game that people figure out what's winning, and it's going to get bet. So I think he's going to be tough. I will certainly use him, but I do want to give one other horse a chance, and that's the 5 Commandeer. I actually really liked his first turf race, and I think he's going to be up quite a bit closer than he was. He had some real trouble at the start that day, almost went to his face. There were a couple horses that broke bad, one much worse than him, but his was still very noticeable, and I think he ran a really good race first time on turf. He was coming all the way to the wire, and maybe if this is just a little bit too short for Tribhuvan off the layoff, he would be the one I'd be most interested in.
Yeah, it's interesting that the pace projector shows him so close to Tribhuvan because looking at his running lines, Commandeer has never really been on the front end. He's been in a stalking position before, and Tribhuvan's just kind of got this reputation as a runoff speed horse. I think that has a lot to do, Craig, with the fact that Tribhuvan has competed in 1.5 mile and 1 3/8 races, even 1 1/4 in 3 or 4 of his last 5 starts. So generally, the pace figures are going to be lower in those longer races. But we've seen Tribhuvan show that kind of speed going 1 1/8 before. So if anything, I would say that his early pace rating is maybe a little too low, and Commandeer's early pace rating is maybe a little too high because it's based strongly on his dirt races where he showed more speed than in the turf race last time. So we'll see. I mean, I do kind of view Trubovan as going to be on a clear lead here, not getting much pressure. We'll see how Paco Lopez rides Commandeer because, as you said, he did have some trouble at the start last time, and he's capable of showing more speed than that. Given the fact that he ran so well with that off-the-pace style, I wonder if they'll be looking to change it up here. But he's definitely a horse that did show some improvement on the turf because his form on the dirt prior to that looked like it had just gone in the wrong direction. He's one that just hadn't gone on after showing some promise in late 2021. But he got back on track last time, almost won that race. There have been runbacks out of there that have been strong and confirmed with speed figures. So I agree, he's one to consider. I also think that the two horses coming out of the dinner party at Pimlico on Preakness Day should also merit some consideration here. Never Explained, probably a last time was the time horse because you got 15-1 when he was the winner that day, and he got a perfect ride and trip from Flavien Prat. Maybe he's not going to be quite as fortunate here if he's got to close into what could be a more moderate pace with a lone speed signed on. But speaking Scout, it's not like he ran that much worse than Never Explain, having to come from further back in the pack. And I kind of view these horses as having similar chances, and Speaking Scout just figures to be a much bigger price. So I would kind of lean towards using him along with Trubovan as the main two. Obviously emphasizing Trubovan because he'd be my top pick in this race, and I do think he's a pretty likely winner here. But just looking for some others that maybe could slip through the cracks, I guess I'd identify Speaking Scout as perhaps one of those.
I think we're on the same camp in that I don't want to go too deep in a race like this. That's why I kept it at two. It sounds like you mostly are too. So we just chose a different second horse. And I wanted to say I agree with you about the pace. I don't think Commandeer is going to be up there with Tribhuvan. And it shows how fast he is because normally horses coming out of those longer races, as you mentioned, are usually shown pretty far back on the pace projector when they cut back in distance. And we hear a lot of people questioning that, and usually it actually plays out. Those horses don't make the lead in these races on the turn back, but Tribhuvan has done it before, and he will probably do it again, particularly from that inside post. And like you, he would be where most of my play went through.
I will say before we move on from this race, I do not like the horse that is vying for second choice on the morning line. I'll be surprised if he actually takes that much money, but the number 6 Catnip, I mean, he'd be one that I'd be against in here. Just has competed against lower level horses, has gotten pretty good trips, or it did last time, a little bit of a tougher trip too back. But to me, just doesn't look like he's proven he's this class yet. Maybe I'll take some money because Joel Rosario's in to ride, but he would not be for me in this race, and I'd be looking more towards those horses that are proven at the level.
Yeah, we're on the same page there.
All right, Craig, let's finish it up with the one non-stakes race in the sequence, the final race of the day on this 14-race card. It's an N1X allowance event for the 3-year-olds going 6 furlongs, and personally, when I handicapped this race, I had trouble finding clever angles. It looked fairly straightforward to me. The number 2, Smooth Flying Mike, I guess he is the horse to beat. He's the 8-5 favorite on the morning line. Just watching his last race felt like a horse that simply couldn't get the mile. He opened up around the far turn like he was going to win for fun, and you could just see with a furlong to go, he hit the wall, and it looked like the eventual winner, Alternate Reality, was going to get nothing at that point, but the fact that Smooth Flying Mike came back to the field, it sort of allowed the race to collapse. He got beat by a good foe, 2-back, in that race at Parks, and just feels like one that might be okay sprinting. But I mean, there are some others that have run similar speed figures, so I don't know how much of an edge he really has, but I probably would identify him as the horse to beat.
I would agree. When I was looking at it, I never want to default to the favorite if I can. But he does have a, 4 or 5 point edge on the other speed figure wise. I guess my one concern would be that he draws inside of his two main competitors in here, the 5 and the 7. But the more I looked at it, I just don't really love any of those horses either. I mean, they could win, but they've had chances, particularly the 7 horse, Heldish, who's had multiple chances at this level and just hasn't been able to get it done, often at short prices. He did draw inside in a lot of those races, but he didn't have a big excuse on Preakness Day. Wasn't able to win there. So I just had problems getting excited about it, any of these. Of the top three morning line choices, it was hard for me to split them. Probably other than the two. The next two were similar, the five Noda and Heldish. If I was going to make a push for one horse that might be a little bit of a price, and it's not anything crazy because he's the fourth choice, it would be the three Torone, who comes out of an allowance race at Aqueduct. And I went back and watched that race. He finished behind Heldish that day by a few lengths. I guess there was a little bit of excuse in that he was chasing a fast pace. He did make a pretty good move on the turn while a little wide that day. But the one big push I'd have for him is the barn change. He moves into the barn of Carlos David, who, particularly at Monmouth Park, that's a very good angle for him. So if I was going to look for a horse to mildly upset the field, I guess it would be him. But I think we're mostly of similar thought that I just couldn't get excited about anybody in here, and none of the longer price horses struck my fancy.
Yeah, for me, it was tough to get past the three favorites, the 2, 5, and 7. And I mean, I guess if I was going to try to make an interesting point about one of them, I would say that the number 5, Nota, seems like a horse that has a little bit of upside because, it seems like they tried to stretch him out against Kings Barnes over the winter, caught a tough rival two back when they ran in that Keeneland allowance race behind Squire Creek, who's a stakes quality horse. And then last time, he was competing in another race at this level at Monmouth, but that was a much, much tougher N1X allowance race than this one is. I mean, there were some good horses in there. Mr. Swagger, who we had seen in some of the Derby preps, and Zelensky Strong was a long shot that won that race, but a horse that had shown real talent in his debut last year, and some others that finished further back in the pack that had shown some quality. And Noda was able to slip through on the rail. He was pretty aggressive in blinkers for the first time, but he never changed leads in the stretch. He just hung on his left lead the entire way, and I think that really beat him that day. And if he can change leads more professionally this time, I think we could finally see him put it all together in this race. So if I had to make a top pick, it would be Noda over Smooth Flying Mike and Heldish. But I mean, those would be the three that I would be looking to use. Like I said, nothing too clever.
I agree, and that was my one hesitancy. I would like that he's going to be drawn outside with the. He definitely improved with the blinkers. That was something that jumped out at me. So yeah, it's just hard to split straws. Luckily, I'm not going too deep in any of the other legs. I imagine if this stays on turf, it will be a sequence that I play, but it won't be one where I'm spending a ton of money because I do think some of the short prices are going to win.
Yeah, it seems like a sequence that you can attack for not that much money, or maybe you can hit your ticket a few times if you feel pretty good about it, and you're just not using that many horses throughout these 5 races. Personally, for me, it would get a lot easier to put a play together if Farmo Power runs, because I could kind of anchor my play around my strongest opinion on a price horse, which is him in that middle leg. If he scratches, it would make it a little less appealing for me because I'd be mostly going through Nimitz class in that Salvatore Mile and using a little bit of Bourbonic. And we'll see if any there are any other scratches that affect things, but that would dampen my enthusiasm for this sequence a little bit. I would still want to take a couple shots against Kings Barnes in that first leg, using Classic Catch and Salute the Stars. And then in the 11th race, I would want to lean on Surprisingly, who I don't know if she's the most likely winner. It's tough to say that with a horse like Gina Romantic in the race, but I just feel like she's going to be a better price than Gina Romantic. I think there'll be a bigger gap than you see on the morning line, and she was the one that I really wanted there. I covered the Salvatore Mile, and I would lean on Tribuvan in that Monmouth Stakes. I just think he's the most likely winner, going to get the right trip, and I'd use a little Speaking Scout as the backup. And then in the last leg, just given how thinly I went prior to that, I wouldn't complicate it too much. I'd probably use Noda as the A, and then the 2 and 7 as Bs, but I'd just use those 3 horses.
Yeah, I'll just go through mine real quick. I would probably be against King's Barn mostly. I would lean on Subrogate and Salute the Stars a little more, but I'm not going to totally dismiss King's Barnes because he could certainly win off of that Derby trip. In the 11th, I'm with you on the inside horse, the Shug McGahee horse.
Surprisingly.
Surprisingly, yes. I think I like her. I think she's going to offer more value than even what that morning line says. I don't know if I would use Gina Romantic or not. I guess you kind of have to. you swayed me on Malvath. I won't be shocked if she wins, but she's going to be overbet off that Breeders' Cup line. So she's one I would probably just not use in here at all. And I do think there's going to be some real pace in there with that 7 horse who could set it up for surprisingly. She hasn't had that kind of trip in quite a while. The Salvatore, I think Nimitz class is going to be tough. He's the one that I would key on, but I would also use a couple of the closers, namely Bourbonic and far more power, who's more of a probably a presser type in this situation, but certainly has some hidden form. Uh, Tribuvan and Commandeer for me, that would be about it in the Monmouth Stakes. And then the last race, I would just go with the 3 favorites and then maybe use the 3 as like a C type horse if I had a ticket comprised where maybe 2 or 3 other favorites could win and was looking to get a little price in there.
Yeah, it's not a sequence where we had to go quite as deep as some others that we've discussed, especially recently. I recall that Belmont sequence we did a couple weeks ago that was, just really tough to wrap your head around. This one, not like that, but it's nice to have some variety in the types of sequences that we handicap on this forecast. Well, Craig, good luck to you if you're playing Monmouth this weekend. Hopefully we stay on the turf. We'll see how the weather shakes out later today and into tomorrow. And good luck to all of you if you're playing the races this weekend. Everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Forecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for listening, and make sure to catch the TimeformUS Pacecast coming up next week.